It appears that one way that I can fit in quickly is wear bright socks. Or have facial hair. I guess that's the other way. Whenever a guest speaker comes to speak, invariably that speaker is given about 1 minute to 5 minutes to convince the audience that they'll listen. A public speaker, apart from the Spirit of God, is given about 1 minute to 5 minutes to build that bridge. So, please like me. God has allowed me to pastor for 38 years, beginning in Michigan to Pennsylvania to Georgia, and then the last 6 years, we have been on faculty at Maranatha Baptist University, where I am in charge of the missions department. The reason I'm in charge of the missions department is because God has brought us there, but of my missions background. The university was not necessarily looking for someone who had a doctor's degree in missiology, but rather one who had grown up in it, felt it, understood the nuances of being on the mission field. The whole cross-cultural issue, both ways, coming back to America and likewise going to a foreign field. My parents left for Brazil in 1952, so they are the post-war crowd that attended either Bob Jones University, Wheaton College, or Moody Bible Institute. Those three schools were the schools that sent out, at that time, evangelical missionaries. Dad was a World War II vet, fought in Europe, Battle of the Bulge, and came back and went to Moody Bible Institute. We got to the coast after 9 months of raising support. 9 months. I was born a year later. Mom and Dad boarded a freighter in New York Harbor to go to the part of Brazil that stretches out towards Africa. It's the northeast section right below the equator, right below the Amazon River. They were on that barge for 3 weeks. There were no guardrails. There was a 4-year-old boy, a 2-year-old daughter, and an infant child. 3 weeks with no guardrails. When we docked, when my family docked, there was no way of coming to port because of the tide. And so the Brazilians, now again, Mom and Dad had not taken a pre-field trip. That was not normal in those days. So they did not know the language. Had not met a Brazilian other than when they docked for a brief stay in the Amazon, Belém. And so they sent out balsa wood boats that probably were no wider than the platform area and much shorter than the platform area. Just one-masted sailboats with about 6 or 7 balsa beams brought together. And they told Mom and Dad in their language, throw your kids overboard and we'll catch them. So they said, wait till the crest brings the boat up, time it. Now, how do you do that in pre-field ministry? Time when to throw kids overboard. This is really important. So again, a 4-year-older and a 2-year-older and an infant. And my father couldn't swim a stroke. My mom was a very good swimmer. What would you do as a human couple? What would you do with parents? How would you handle that? I wasn't aware of this till at my mom's funeral. My oldest brother, the 4-year-older, tells the story that Mom had said to my dad, well, if we can't trust God now, let's just stay on the boat and go back. And so 3 kids were thrown overboard. Mom and Dad spent a year in language school. And I'll share this about Mom and Dad's ministry. We were the first Americans that lived in the city of Nova Russas. Limited amount had gone through, but we were the first to live there. In those years, I was blonde, and I was the only blonde in counties. And it was very embarrassing to the marketplace because they had never seen a blonde. And if I had any hopes of my pre-junior high years of looking good, when I'd go to market day, they would want to touch my hair and run their fingers through my hair. It was just humiliating till I became a teenager. And that kind of attention was just too much. They had never, well, they had. There was one refrigerator in town which belonged to the bar. The other one was ours. It was a kerosene refrigerator that maybe you don't understand. A kerosene refrigerator is run by fire. And so you'd open the bottom grid, and there you'd light a fire on the kerosene tank, and you'd pull ice out of the top. And the Brazilians could not comprehend how you made ice with fire. They just walked through our house, looked through the dresser drawers. Along with the bar and the refrigerator, we were the only other family that had a vehicle. Mom and Dad stayed for 3 terms, and Dad's health and our education became a real detriment, and so they came back to the field. And Dad may well have thought that he was a failure. He had spent 16 years starting a church that may have run 30 to 50 people. We then transferred the Bible Institute out to the coast and replicated that to a church that maybe had, again, 50 people. And Dad left broken with health and having lost his passion for ministry. It was a difficult time for our family. Mom and Dad died not knowing this testimony that I'm going to share. We have a daughter, a single daughter in Brazil as a missionary, and we were going to go down and visit her. So I called the original people from this northeast area, the ministry, who are team partners with Mom and Dad, the name Joe Gosen. And I said, I'm going down to São Paulo, southern Brazil, to visit my daughter, and I thought about going up to Nova Russas and seeing the church that Dad started. And he said, Steve, he said, we have tried for years to get a hold of you love boys. There were 5 boys in Mom and Dad's family. And to tell you what God has done to that church in Nova Russas. He said that church now is running about 350 people. And they have started 17 other ministries. They own the radio station in that entire area. My father was persecuted like crazy in Brazil. And now the church he started, in essence, owned the voice in that area. The church out on the coast, likewise, was running over 300 people. And likewise, they had started about 10 to 15 other chapel services. So literally hundreds and hundreds of people came from a ministry that Mom and Dad thought was a failure. And besides, out of Mom and Dad's home, there are 4 preachers that God has used to that incident. Would you take your Bibles, please, to the book of Luke? This is COVID season, and I have allergies. Okay? So if I cough, please, I've already had it. I've been shot up. I don't have it. I will cough for only 1 or 2 reasons. I cough because of allergies. And then I cough when I sense the audience is not listening. That's not fair, is it? My wife will know that I labored much over what to preach for our first service because it can say so much. Knowing the kind of crowd, most likely having pastored for 38 years that I would be speaking to on a Friday night, I wanted to make sure that we would start on a positive, strong note, understanding the audience. I'm going to park on Luke chapter 12, verse 17, and we're going to build around it. Luke 12, 17 says, and he thought within himself. What do you think about when you have nothing to think about? What do you think about when there's no intentionality to your thinking? And he thought within himself. And the two things that come out of this thought process is, also found in verse 17, what shall I do? And where shall I put it? You say, well, preacher, you're speaking to an older audience tonight, and this most likely is a young man just getting started. The context will state that this man was on the verge of retiring. It's the account of, I will build more barns and I'll be at ease. He's on the verge of retirement. And to this setting, to that mindset, that thought within himself and didn't know what to do with what he had and where he had put it, the denunciation of Christ said, thou fool. So to our age group, who's amassed a life of decades of health and God's blessings, and seemingly there's nothing left to do but to wait, we find that Jesus Christ gives this parable of a guy who thought within himself. So I want to ask you, what are you going to do and where are you going to put it if God only gives you 1 year? What are you going to do and where are you going to put it if God gives you 5 years? You say, well, I don't have much time left. This guy didn't. And again, contextually, this guy was facing retirement. What are you going to do? When you think within yourself and say, I've got this and I've got this and I need to take care of this business and I need to make sure that this is right. What are you going to do with what you have? And where are you going to put what you have? If it's a year, if it's 5 years, if it's 20 for some. Again, verse 17, and he thought within himself, saying, what shall I do? And where shall I store? And we know that his thinking was, if I could use this word, was cognitive enough, was intentional enough, that in verse 18 he says, and he said, this will I do. He wasn't going to spend the rest of his time thinking about what to do and where to put it. But out of verse 17, he came away with a solution of what and where, and this I will do. One was, whose life would be rich toward God, verse 21. So he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And one whose life is a fool, verse 21. But God said unto him, thou fool, this night. Now you say, well, preacher, you don't understand my health, and you don't understand what limited budget I have, and you don't understand the energy level that I have. I've lived my life. I'm now looking at the barns of life. I'm looking at, do I have enough barns? Do I need to invest in another barn? This is so important that here are some of the words that are used within this context. The word treasure, verse 34. The word heart, verse 34. The word covetousness in verse 15. The word barns in verse 18. The word inheritance in verse 13. The word beware, verse 1. The word kill, verse 4. The word hell, verse 5. So to this mindset that is about to retire, who's made to think within himself, what am I going to do? And where am I going to put it? Can you imagine that desperation? He most likely by now was childless in the sense that his children had left home. He most likely understood now how energy doesn't last all day. You say, how do you know all this from the context? He had just received an inheritance from his father. So do the math. His home is in the process of emptying out. And this guy is made to think about life. Is this it? Just a bunch of barns? What am I going to do with my life? Verse 15. And he said unto them, Take heed, and beware of covetousness. For a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. My dad raised us 5 boys to be handy. God has allowed me to have a fairly decent wood shop, which I very much like, working with wood. I carve ducks. Not the living ones, the ones just the block of wood. And I like restoring vintage cars. If you know anything about old cars, God gave me the opportunity, or maybe I took it out of covetousness, I don't know. But I restored a 57 Chevy. That is the collector car. And I just loved restoring it. Almost the same time, I restored 2 old vintage Mercedes. And I was kind of in the process of learning there, but by the time I got to the 57 Chevy, it was a keeper. And it was exciting, especially after the paint was done, all the sanding, all the welding, all the body work, and all that. And now you're putting the jewelry back on, the chrome, and it just began to look, and you were just wanting to get it all done in one day because you wanted to see it. And it was done. The barn was full. And there was nothing left that was exciting. Oh, you say, well, couldn't you drive it? Yeah, but it's not as fun as forming. Everybody can drive. Not everybody can fix up a 57 Chevy. My barn got full. What was I going to do? Let's break this down into some quick outline form, just 2 points. The key word is, and he thought within himself. So I ask you again, what do you think about when you have nothing to think about? For example, our drive today was about 6 hours. It's not safe to do what I'm talking about here when you have nothing to think about, autopilot. You have nothing to think about. What do you think about? First point. What am I going to do with my stuff? You say, well, that kind of sounds ordinary for a guy that teaches in a college and has a doctor's degree. What am I going to do with my stuff? Again, the context gives me liberty to add to this content and not do injustice to the context, that what he's saying in a broad sense is, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? That's a stuff issue. What am I going to do with the abilities that I've been given? That's a stuff issue. What am I going to do with the abundance of life? That's a stuff issue. That was very contextual. What am I going to do with my family value system? Again, hypothetically, by conjecture, the kids now were in the process of leaving, and he began to see what was happening to his value system upon his own children. What shall I do? What a great question. Follow with me, please, to some context. Chapter 12, verse 1. In the meantime, when there were gathered together an innumerable multitude of people, insomuch that they trode one upon another, he began to say unto his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. This was a discipling, mentoring, modeling session. This was not an open to the public session. He is speaking to his disciples and saying, are we looking at each other? I want you to be aware of this particular character trait. Verse 13. And one of the company, that's back to verse 1, said unto him, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. Where did this come from? Here Jesus Christ, the master teacher, is teaching his disciples and saying, I want you to be aware of this character trait and this character trait and this tendency, and I want to make sure that this is not in your life. And while he's teaching, someone comes without raising their hand and says, Master, would you somehow solve this inheritance problem? It may be that you are old enough that you have had to sit down with your siblings and divide your parents' inheritance. Lord willing, next week, Thursday, my wife and I will drive from here to do a memorial service in the Atlanta, Georgia area. 3 siblings are left. The mom died about 5 years ago. The father died about 2 weeks ago. What shall we do with the inheritance? Because that seemed to be so germane to what will I do with my life. Verse 18, he must have thought he was going to get a lot, because notice what it says here back in verse 13. And one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance with me. And he said unto him, Man, who made me a judge or a divider over you? The word man there is not spoken in the colloquial way as we do here in America, like man, but human. And he said in verse 15, Take heed, beware of covetousness, for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. And it's almost as if he's speaking to a 7th grade boy or girl. This is an immensely huge subject. And the guy doesn't get one fraction of the advice. Because while Christ is saying, be careful of covetousness, he's thinking about barns. Dad taught his sons to work. And so beginning as a freshman, I worked in an orchard in the southwest side of Michigan. During my high school years, I worked on a potato farm. Oh, that was dirty. I worked on a dairy farm. That was dirtier. They had barns. And I remember Mr. Vern Johnson one day saying, Steve, I want you to go out and clean the cattle stalls. This was much different than picking peaches. It was a whole lot different than the black muck that stuck to your body while digging potatoes. And he says, and when you're done cleaning it, put the stuff in the manure spreader. And he said, I want you to take it out, hook it up to the tractor, and I want you to take it on the field to spread the stuff. And he said, before you kick in the PTO, the power takeoff unit, it is the unit that transfers the energy from the tractor to the manure spreader. He said, check the direction of the wind. What do farmers know? So here we are talking about barns. Barns aren't the safest place to store one's earthly possessions because rats live in barns. Mice live in barns. Raccoons live in barns. Mold lives in barns. But that's where we put our stuff. So our first point is, what am I going to do with my stuff? He thought within himself, what am I going to do and where am I going to put it? I'm going to receive this inheritance. And yes, the master teacher, whom I labeled that, has told me be careful of covetousness. But what does he know? There are 3 things that are given here that should get our attention. To know what to do with our stuff and where to put it. Again, I want to say this. He's not speaking to a 20-year-older. He's speaking to someone who's about to retire. Here's the first thing that should get our attention. Verse 13. And one of the company said unto him, Master, speak to my brother that he divide the inheritance. Catch this. For there to be an inheritance, there has to have been a death. For there to be an inheritance, there has to have been a death. And for it to be an inheritance with a brother, it has to be the death of a father. And it had not gotten his attention. I'm sure your pastor will testify to this. Down through the years, I've done funeral after funeral for unsaved individuals. And invariably, the friends that are left after the service that speaks about heaven and hell, where they've observed someone who's dead, they say, hey, let's go out for a drink. And sometimes the person died because of alcohol or because of an alcohol-related accident. Death in America has become such a celebratory event that it does not make us think. Death is death. I don't care how good it looks on the casket. It's death. My father died of long-term cancer. Dead. My mom died 4 months later in a car accident. Dead. We buried a baby. Dead. I've buried a sister. Dead. Death, though seemingly is ruled by Satan, is timed by God. And it is sent by God, catch this, by God's providence to come at points in our life where hopefully we are most receptive to what death does. If death cannot make you think within yourself, what will? What am I going to do with my stuff? A death had just occurred. Something else, verse 18. And he said, this will I do, I'll pull down my barns and build greater, and there I'll bestow all my fruits and my goods. This man is speaking of a lifetime of health and good business venture. But even at the end of his business venture, he realizes, I'm not fully prepared. There's nothing in this section that condemns what he's done. There's nothing in this section that condemns what he has. Now think of it, a job. It's something we spend 12 years of our high school years preparing to work. And then we work for 40 years to prepare for retirement. And then we spend 20 years in retirement with little regard to the reality of the next step. He's speaking to our age. What hope to realize we're not just people done with life. We are people who still have life, who should know what to do. My brother-in-law at Maranatha has cancer of the eye. They've already taken the eye out. The doctors have given him within a year's time to live. I, 3 others, married into a family of 5 daughters. No men in the house, well, the father, but just 5 girls, and they all married Baptist preachers. So one of the sons-in-law said, we need to get together before Marty Marriott's health becomes decrepit to his energy. So about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we began to talk about where life was with us. Not just with Marty, who's already received the sentence of death, but us. And I just made this snide comment. And I said the truth of the matter is that all of us already have our blinkers on, don't we? All of us are almost off the exit ramp. Our 5, our 10 are almost at the end. Does death wake you up? Does the privilege of having a job that doesn't do a thing to prepare you for eternity? The last of these 3 sub-thoughts is a conscience. Verse 19, and I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much needs, or thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat and drink, and be merry. Verse 20, but God said, thou fool. You say he didn't have any conscience. You're right. I remember I stole some money from my mom's purse as a high schooler. It wasn't until I had pastored into my second church that I thought within myself and said, I have got to get rid of this conscience problem, and called my dad up. If death doesn't get my attention to think within myself, of what to do with my stuff, if my job, which provides for the needs of life but has no eternal fulfillment, does not make me think about what to do with my stuff, if on the end of the road all I can think about is, where's the other barn? If my conscience second point, where am I going to put my stuff? You say, preacher, don't you get it? We're probably not going to become missionaries out of this missions conference. The percentage of people that need to be left behind, should be left behind, is multiple times the percentage of the one that goes. Lord willing, we're going to finish our Sunday afternoon service by how to pray for missionaries. You say, well, we get that every year. We want to give you hands-on. I can pray. I can encourage. I remember my dad coming home from a missions conference. We were still middle junior high years. And going up to one of our good supporting churches, and a person who had been in that church multiple years came up to my dad and said, now, who are you? That does not speak of a life that prays for that missionary. Oh, yeah. Where do you serve? My parents died in 1992. So 70 years after they left the mission field, 50 years after they left the mission field, went to the mission field. Dad did not have enough to bury him. And it was kind of embarrassing to go through their earthly possessions. It was a couple of cardboard boxes. And that was it. I mean, that wasn't even a corn crib. It wasn't a barn. But without them knowing, they left behind 2 very large churches. My father led the town drunk to the Lord, who became the nucleus of the church. Out of that church came a family. They were dynamic for Christ. Iracema is in heaven today. Manuel is in heaven today. Elias, Betinho, Elias, José, Pedro, Maria, Antônio, Raimundo, Joaquim, Tata. That sounds like a pretty good barn, doesn't it? And it's not of mom and dad's doing. It's of our home church in Moline, Michigan. Of Dad's sending church in Covey Hill, Michigan. It's in a church in Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. I didn't recognize it until I went there during my college years. And multiple churches all over the Midwest who at that time gave their $10, $15, $20, $50 at the most. And prayed. And prayed. So what am I going to do with a Friday evening service? The purpose of today's message is, and he thought within himself. So if the Spirit of God has made you think within yourself, I want you to think about, what am I going to do? And where am I going to put it? Within a culture that was ready to retire, in the age group of receiving inheritances and knowing where to invest it, Jesus Christ said, "Thou fool." I lift a quote. I am rich toward God when His glory is my highest goal, when His worship is my deepest joy, when His fellowship is my greatest satisfaction, I am rich toward God when I offer my abilities for His work without reserve. I am rich toward God when I take the time to serve people in need and give the first portion of everything I get to gospel work. I am rich toward God when I make the needs of the poor a priority in my financial giving and embrace a simple lifestyle that gives me more freedom for ministry. I am rich toward God when I decide that there are some things I can live without so that I can have more to give to people who do not even have the gospel. I came back to America to remember it as a second grader and a seventh and a ninth grader and stayed. And I remember as a seventh grader, as my father would go out, we go as a family. I was just part of the process. Mom and Dad had a rule that everybody in our home had to play 2 instruments. And so I played the trumpet. And my wife doesn't want me to say this in public, but the accordion. To her, it's not an instrument. When she found out that I'd played the accordion, she said, "But you don't do polka, do you?" That is my real part there. So we just traveled with Mom and Dad. And I listen, and I understand hospitality. But some of the homes we went to, it was as if our American brothers and sisters were showing off to us. And I remember as a seventh grader thinking, I'll never have this. I won't have this kind of luxury. I remember the first new winter coat I got. You said, well, of course, you grew up in the equator. Well, I'd come back to America a couple of times. I was a seventh grader. I remember missionaries always being second-class citizens in the local church. That was just my perception as an MK. Then when you could no longer use it, you gave it to the missionary. I close with a sad story, but humorous. We had been given a Duncan Fife table at our first church. This was in the thumb of Michigan. And it already needed some carpentry skills. And it's a table that has a drop leaf and usually 3 swoop legs. Well, the swoops on the legs were broken. So I went down to the hardware store and got myself a screw about that long and put them back in. And we used it for, probably 15 years. Well, it finally was just at the end. In fact, towards the end, when Mom would set the table, it tilted so much that we knew what side of the plate to put the gravy on, if you know what I mean. We just knew if we wanted it on the potatoes, you put it here. So we had sold our house in Michigan, got very little out of it, and I wanted to buy my wife a dining room set. So we did, and it was a surprise. The 4 daughters took her out shopping in the mall. My son, who was maybe a 7th grader, maybe a 5th grader, stayed home to help me load it in, and we called our assistant pastor. We took the Duncan Fife table out, put it in the garage, and we brought in this nice oak, solid wood, arched back chairs. I mean, it was just nice. And I said to my son, I said, what are we going to do with the other table? Oh, he said, Dad, give it to the missionaries. I'm thinking, have I failed? In a home where I was sensitive to this, he had picked up on it. A whole book of the Bible is written about how to take care of God's servants. 3 John. A whole book of the Bible. And he thought within himself, what shall I do and where will I put it? Lord willing, tomorrow afternoon, late afternoon, Sunday morning and Sunday afternoon, we'll share again simplistic messages like that. That you can walk out and say, yeah, I know what he said. And I know what the Word of God expects of it. Heavenly Father, I pray your grace upon all the effort that's been put, preparing meals, hosting, all the communication, the travel, the safety, the health, all that you've done to tie this weekend together. That at the very least tonight, we'd be made to think within ourselves about what we're going to do with our stuff and where are we going to put it. We ask this in your name. Amen.